Marius Schneider, welcome to Inside the Manege.
Thank you very much. Welcome to my stable.
Thank you very much. This time we find ourselves literally inside the Manege because we're here inside your riding stable, or inside your arena at your riding stable, Gestüt Moorhof in Germany. Marius, you're one of only a few master trainers in the academic art of riding. You're teaching very actively, and you have a wonderful way, I think, of teaching everything that you do with
Thank you.
a very measured and detail-oriented approach, which I really appreciate. I'm very excited about our conversation today and to get a bit of a deeper look into the work that you do. What is it that originally drew you to the academic art of riding, and what really drove you to become a master in the academic art of riding?
Yeah, I have to say, I had the luck to grow up with horses. So my parents, they had a big stable. In the beginning, a stable for children, for beginners. And that was good for me because I grew up with a lot of horses. We had 45 horses in that time.
Wow.
And everything mixed, shetty, pony, and so on. And not so much out of riding horses. And yeah, that was good for me because there was not a real high educated horse. So I did more or less everything by myself, but also the normal problems with horses which I had in that time. For example, how to get a good relationship to a horse, how to do all this horsemanship training, and stuff like hacking out in walk, trot, canter, with the shetty, with the pony problems, and so on. That was quite a nice time, especially with a big group of other kids, I would say. So, and then I think it was in my teenager time, I had the luck to see also different perspectives of training. So in the beginning, it was not the totally normal riding school training. It was also influenced with our own philosophy. My mother, for example, she had a special concept which took into account the physical and mental part and age of the kids. So, and then she did her own, let's say, educational program, riding program for the kids. And that was good for me because it was directly a different step into the art of riding. But she was also very interested in other trainers, other systems. And in that time, I met Ben Branderup, and that's quite a long time ago. But that was good because I was still in the age where I was searching for the right way, when I say it like that. And it was quite fascinating to see how band could change with little details, big problems. Yeah? And the next thing was how light it could be. So when he changed something, then he changed it in a way that I do not need a lot of craft, I would say.
Strength, yeah.
Strength, yes. And it was everything so easy done. And the horses, yeah, they really told me in that time, that's the way I want. Instead of a way which was with a lot of effort, with a lot of leg pressure or rein pressure. In that time, it was not the time where I changed everything completely, of course. You are in a system, and then you run through different educational steps, and I did education and a professional rider education and so on. But I kept always in my mind and heart, there is also a different way.
And this is what you do now.
Yeah, that's actually what I do now. Yeah.
So there's only a few master trainers. I think every rider has their own person,
Yes.
and so they have their own strengths and particular interests. What is it that you really focus on in your own work, and what do you think kind of differentiates you from the other master trainers that there are?
Yeah, high individual, I always say. Everybody is different. I cannot really say I am totally different than, for example, Christopher or whatever. But when I speak about my person, I would say I have varied techniques. So I concentrate a lot of different things. For example, liberty work, groundwork, the riding itself, of course, then the horsemanship training, and so on. So I'm very interested in the schools about the earth, but this is something which I do nowadays with my experience I have right now. But all the rest, especially the basic work, is still totally important for me. And I would say, even if I'm very much into the higher level education or higher level exercises, I love the basic training, and that's also one of my specific thing, because I know when you have some trouble in the basic work, you get also some trouble in the higher work.
Absolutely.
Maybe this is something which you understand more the more experience you have. And the more experience you have, you really take care that the basic work is absolutely safe. It's a fundament we need. And it makes also a lot of fun, I have to say. Because when I start a new horse, a green horse, for example, then I can take my experience I have right now and can start new with my basic training. The system of the basic training is clear, it's the same, but always I can add a little detail in it, which makes everything easier for the next educational year and the next educational year. That's also the reason why I'm so fascinated from this work, because it's never ever boring, I would say.
That is true.
Yeah, that's true.
What would you say are some of the most important things to you in training, or like the fundamental principles that you follow?
The most important thing for me is also that the horse does it because the horse has also a lot of joy. I do not like when I ask my horse something, but the horse doesn't like it, doesn't like to work with me. So I focus a lot on a good partnership. I know everybody says partnership and harmonic work and so on, but it's true that I try to seek for the talents and also for the things they want. When I have a new horse, and even if it's a horse of a pupil, I try to find out what is the best thing the horse could do. And then I often start also with that way, with that training, with that talent. Even if I don't forget about the fundament, as I mentioned before, the basic work, but I can maybe try to add it into the basic work. And this is possible for me nowadays, because sometimes from the normal way, I can go a little bit to the right and to the left to add it, but I do not lose the right way in it. And I try to find a concept for my pupil as well, because the pupil cannot go from the normal straight way to the right and left, because there is not enough experience to do that. It will happen that they get into the wrong way. But I can try to guide them to do it for the horse. And I think it's also very tricky. When we educate a horse, we often speak about education, training of a horse. But in the end, it isn't only that. It's also human training. And I need to find out, how can I make a good training for both of them, that the horse still has very much joy.
So, like you're saying in your work, also in the academic art of riding, but especially in your work, there's a lot of focus on the groundwork, the lunging, the work in hand, and also liberty work in your case.
Yes.
What do you find is really the key ways that this is helpful for the horse in the overall training?
Yeah. Actually, the playful way of training, I always say. First of all, there is no rider. I mean, no rider who can disturb, and no rider who disturbs with their own weight. Even if I have a really experienced rider, in the beginning and during the educational years, it can happen that's very tricky for a horse, because when they do exercises which are very powerful and which are very dynamic, then it can happen that it's hard with a rider on top. So it takes months, years to do that. And when I train with a horse without a rider in the groundwork, then is everything a little bit easier because it's just a horse. But it's still effective because we train with the body rate of the horse. And we know, when we compare it with humans, we know a lot of techniques, training techniques, where we train with our own weight without using extra weight. And this is what I try to do. And with the groundwork, I say we did an upgrade of the art of riding. It's not only groundwork, as you maybe know, in between the pillars or on the Cavesson. It is also an upgraded groundwork in a way of liberty or advanced longing. Advanced longing is something which is really effective for our work. Advanced longing means we make differences between basic longing and the advanced longing in that way that the basic longing is a training in walk, trot and canter on the longe, as you know, in a traditional way. But in that way, we influence the horse from the inside. That means I stay as a human in the middle of a circle and everything comes from the inside towards the horse. So of course we can do the right bending, the shaping, the stepping under and so on. But we are not able to do this whole frame of aids around the horse, which you know in riding. With the advanced longing, we can do that. That's absolutely fascinating because I can give also an outside leg aid, for example, or an outside rein aid, even if I do not have any leg or rein. I can do that, for example, with a little sign of the whip or with a little change of my body language. And then I get this nice frame around the horse. And from that point, we can do everything, which you know in the art of riding, exercises, of training things and so on. So I can do haunches in, shoulder in. I can do also half pass towards me. I can do a runway away from me. I can do flying changement and. And when I have this key, then I can prepare my horse without the rider. And then I can add as a next training level the rider's weight and also the rider's movement. And everything is for me and for the horse, I have the feeling, much easier then.
Yeah.
I think everybody knows the normal basic training with a young horse on the longe. That's nothing new. And there's the same idea. The idea is to prepare the horse for the riding. And in the academic art of riding, we go a little step more further on, modern stop more further on. We say we do not prepare the young horse, only the young horse. We also prepare the more advanced horse for the even more advanced exercises. And when I speak about playful work, then I mean that I can do in the advanced longing also a lot movement game, I say sometimes. So the horse does something in the movement, for example, trot, and then I ask for a stop. And then the horses from this dynamic stop show me the talent, for example, for school hold or for the levade or even for croupade. And when I see that they show that by themselves, then I know exactly that will be my way to ask for a jump, for example. The bending of the haunches and even some dynamic movement on the haunches is something for the more advanced horse. But I add that already in the beginning. I do not force the horse, of course, but I ask the horse if it has fun, if it likes that kind of work. And there are so many horses, they really like that. Even horses which are not the typical art of riding horse, they like, for example, a mezairs. because it's a really nice dynamic work and not so statical. They do not have to hold so long the whole weight on the haunches, and then they often feel much more movable. And if they show something like that, then I always say, yes, that's great, let's do that. And that's the reason. I mean, there are many reasons, but that's one reason why I say groundwork can help to do everything more playful.
I think this is such a good point, and it's super interesting because I think a lot of people are really only familiar, especially in sport, with just the regular lunging, meaning they need to walk, trot, canter, both directions, and that's really all they ever learn.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or it's to exercise the horse or to let them let off steam, let off extra energy.
And
but
it's so boring.
It is boring.
It's really boring for the horse, but it's also boring for me. When the typical way which I learned in the past was longing in the round arena, for example, and then it was sometimes 40 minutes, 50 minutes, yeah. And then you have a quite clear, let's say, ritual. 10 minutes walk, 20 minutes trot, after that 15 minutes canter, something like that.
Yeah.
It's so boring for the horse to go around on the circle. It has also not really a good training effect, or let's say there are better training effects for this idea. And it's also boring for the human. But the most important thing is it is boring for the horse. And if the horse feels, a training which just makes tired also mentally, then they do not present their own talents. And they just say, okay, I shut up, I close up, also mentally, and then we do not get the glamour we could get of a horse.
Yeah, well said. And for example, like you're saying, it also helps with preparing the horse for exercises because they don't have the rider's weight on their back. And so some things are easier for them to develop. They don't need so much strength. And you also mentioned, for example, you use more or less mostly the Cavesson to lunge and to do the work in hand and so on. Also for me, when I was growing up in the hunter jumpers, so most people would lunge directly onto the bit, and this is how I learned.
And the side reins or whatever?
No side reins for me, but yes. And then also people who do horsemanship, for example, they might lunge on a rope halter. But could you maybe mention any benefits you see of using the Cavesson specifically versus the rope halter or lunging on the bit?
Absolutely, yes. When I use a Cavesson, we have in a traditional way 3 rings. One is in the middle, left or right ring. Sometimes if you have a multifunctional Cavesson like we have, you have maybe 5 rings because of the range which we use later on, and also a halter ring. But the middle ring is the most important ring in the beginning, because the middle ring makes it possible that we can send some informations with the hand through the horse's spine. And we can also get some informations back.
And how does this work?
Yeah, that works because we explain the horse, first of all, how they should respond. So when I give, for example, a sign for a little bit downward stretch, let's say forward down, then we first of all explain how to do that. What is the right idea of it? We never ever start longing by taking longe, Cavesson, and then let's go on the circle, because it doesn't work. The horse will go against it instead of giving. So therefore, it comes the explanation. What is it, what we want? So then we explain the forward down, we explain also the left and right standing, and we explain the upwards movement. I could also say we need all directions, down and so on, all directions to get the right response. We do that because we know when the horse understands in which movement it could give instead of going against, we can really influence the complete spine. And that's not so easy. When we say we influence the paw or the head of the horse, then we always influence also the rest. The question is just how. We can use or influence in a good way, in a holistic way, or we influence just in some parts, or in some parts which means that the horse maybe also push against the hand. So, and the first thing what we do is we influence the head joints of the horse. It's a bit similar to the humans as well. Because when the horse can give in the head joints, we pass through the cervical spine, and then we can have also a closer look if the cervical spine does the right job, or if it goes maybe in different directions. The cervical spine, as you know, is high movable. That's good and bad. In some cases it's good. In some cases it can be a big challenge for us, because it can happen that the horse also flex too much in the neck. It's always a tricky thing when we speak about standing and bending. So, and when the cervical spine is in a good way, we go through the shoulders, thoracic spine, and so on, until we get a contact to the hindquarter.
And one thing to clarify, you say Stellning and bending. Could you define Stellning?
Yeah, the Stelling is, for me, everything which is around the head. So the head joints, I often say, that the horse is movable in the head joint. And when this happens, I place more or less the skull and the cheek of the horse. And when everything goes through the whole spine, then it's the bending for me. So that's the reason why I make difference in between it. It makes it sometimes also easier for the pupils, because they exactly know where they should search for in that moment. For the horses, it's a bit the same, because when they do not know the differences, it can happen that they turn, for example, the head to the left, but unfortunately the hindquarter to the right. And then we have two different ways, which makes it quite complicated in that case. And that's the reason what I like with the Cavesson, it's much easier. You asked me about the knot halter, right?
The rope halter.
Rope halter, yeah. So, yeah, you can longe, but the problem is you have the contact on the chin, below the chin.
Yeah.
And when we have the contact over there, it can happen when the horse gets a little influence on the rope that the whole mouth turns, for example, on the left lead to the left. And then the paw, the ears turn to the right. We call that tilted. So the horse is tilted, it's in a wrong axis, and then we have more or less a bad or wrong influence on the whole spine. This is an automatically behavior of a horse when they feel the impulse more under the chin. On top of the nose, it's totally different, because we really take the completely skull in that way that the cheek runs under the Alea Atlantis, the Atlas wing, we often say. And then we get the real stelling which we need. The good thing is you can see that also in the rest of the body. When a horse shows a correct stelling, we see that the inside hip of a horse often moves a bit forward. And that's so fascinating with groundwork. Groundwork helps to see, I often say, because everything what you do, you can see directly. When you ride a horse, you do not see what you do. Yes, you see what happens in the front, but you do not see what happens behind, and you cannot see what happens under your seat. Of course, we always say you do not need to see that, because you can feel that. But honestly, feeling is totally difficult and different. That's also the reason why there exist so many seat concepts nowadays, because every human feels in a different way, and it can happen when you feel something that you also understand it in a different way, because you think this feeling is a good feeling, but maybe it's not a good feeling. And in groundwork, you can immediately see the change in the horse's body, and then you have an inner picture of that, and you can take your inner picture up to the saddle. That makes everything much better. When a horse steps beside the point of gravity, for example, and the rider do not feel that, then I can say, at least as a trainer, now happens what you have seen before in groundwork. The inside hind moves away from the point of gravity and it feels like that. And then the rider knows exactly, yeah, I know, I have seen that before. The next positive aspect is I could take an educated horse, educated groundwork horse, also in hand. So I could take the horse into the groundwork, even if the rider is on top. And then I can start to create the right feeling for the rider. So there are many reasons why I love you. I think you hear I love groundwork. Why I love groundwork, because we have so many possibilities to teach. One thing, in addition, when we use this multifunctional Cavesson, we have also a halter ring on the chin lash. It's a bit similar to the rope halter, but we use it just in the moment where the horse understood the main shape. And then I often say it's your responsibility. It's a responsibility of the horse to take this shape. And it's not so much my hand, for example, who helps a little bit. So, and then I can use it without any trouble, because I have also a lot of other aids and I can shape from behind up to the front. And that's maybe something what I should add when I say we explain the different aids and we try to explain the correct body awareness for the horse to shape. Then we do that in the front, but just as teaching, not as do that, forcing. So we teach the horse, and not in the end, quite quick in the education. After a few weeks with a young horse, I start to educate from behind more and more. But first of all, I try to get the hindquarter into an influence, into a contact by shaping in the front, in the groundwork.
And what about if you compare with lunging onto the bit instead? How is that different as well?
The problem is when you use, there are different techniques, but when you use, for example, the snap of the longe and the inside ring of the snaffle, then you have no influence, because the snaffle is not made for this movement. So the snaffle is more made for movement where you can sit on the horse, you can go a little bit to the right and left. Yes, there is an influence right and left, but mainly it is also for seeking the bit with a bit lateral flexion influence. But it's not made for one pull on the side. And that's the reason why I say the bit cannot get into the real influence which we normally want on the longe. Even if you do different techniques, for example, this combination with a, I don't know the word, but with the slash under the chin to contact both rings, then you have maybe just one ring in the middle. It's the same. Often the bit gets a wrong influence in the mouth if you get a little pull on that. So and that's the reason why I say I don't want the bit if I cannot use the correct function of the bit. It has nothing to do with the snaffle bit. It has just something to do with longing and the bit in that moment. When I do handwork, for example, or when I do the riding, then of course I see an absolutely good effect in the bit or in the snaffle bit, but not in longing. And there's another thing which I always say, and this is if you don't need it, why you should use it. And this is one of my main things which I try to add in all my education. When I don't need it, then I don't use it. So when I can do it bitless, perfect, because when I start my green horse bitless, then I can always ride my horse in the more advanced work bitless, because I like it to do bitless when everything is so soft and easy done. And that's also a bit the reason why I start bitless. There's the next reason. A young horse will also change a lot. It will change in the mouth. So if I use directly the bit, then it can happen when the teeth are growing and so on and the mouth gets sensitive that they have some stress. with that. And then they get stressed in the training, not because of my training. Even if I try everything very soft and easy, it can happen that growing means stress for the body. As a human has the same problem. And then for myself, I'm a better trainer when I can say, okay, in that time I take the bit out and I use just the Cavesson. And then when everything is done, we take the bit.
So it's a bit like making things as simple as possible, but as complicated as necessary.
Yes, yes, of course. Every horse is different. And I cannot say that everything works always in the same way, never ever. Yeah? Especially not if you train so many different breeds. I'm open for all breeds. I love all horses. Even if people see me nowadays with a lot of Lusitanos, Spanish horses, I love Lusitanos, yes, but in the past, I had a lot of warm blood horses and a lot of horses where I cannot say what kind of breed it is. For example, my Aramis, I often say it's a child of love. You never know what it is, but I love him very much, and he did an absolutely fantastic job, but he helped me also to educate myself a lot. He was, for example, one of the main horses to explain me the sense of liberty work. But anyway, what I want to say is I try to find the best tool for the horse, which it needs in that time, but it can also change. But my main concept is in the beginning, bitless, and then I start with a bit, and then I see what the horse needs.
Very interesting. And to go into more about the bit, how do you go about training the horse to the bit, or else if you get a horse in for training, how do you retrain them to the bit?
First of all, I start without the bit, but I do bit training. And I give maybe the horses a little bit more time than some people does, for example. I don't know. But I give them a lot of time to understand the bit. I mean, not the education of the bit. I mean, really getting used to the bit. When a horse gets a bit into the mouth, they don't like it. It wouldn't be true when I say a horse likes a bit, even if I can hear that sometimes this argument that horses like the bit. But honestly, first of all, the horse says, "What's that?" Yeah, and then we can get used to something, like we have to do in our world, in the human world. We have to get used to something. And I give them a little bit time in that way that I often just go for a walk. I don't add the bit in the training. That's maybe a bit special, because when I do groundwork training and my horse needs also bit training or getting used to the bit, then I don't add everything together, because when they are a little bit too uneasy in the mouth, because it's very strange for them, then they cannot concentrate. And when my pupil, in that case my horse, cannot concentrate, what shall I do? I cannot educate. And I really like a pupil which is concentrated and focused on me, because everything goes so quick when they listen, when I do something, because they're very clever. But when they are not listening, it doesn't work. So therefore, I split it often. I do training, I explain something, I have a great time with my horse, and then I say, okay, and now we maybe do a little bit the bit training. Yeah? And then I lead them through the arena. I try to add some easy stuff, which they know already in the training, and then I take the bit out again. And after a while, they are very fine with the bit. And then I start with real training, or with the education of the bit. So I do not train my horse with some exercises and they have to get used to it. I train my horse that I educate the bit, that they really know, okay, when I get a little influence to that side, it means giving, like I do with a Cavesson. It's absolutely the same, but of course the influence is different because it's inside and not on the surface. And that's the reason why it often takes a bit time, and it's also easier on the groundwork, with the groundwork instead of riding. And before I ride my horse with a bit and influence in riding with a bit, I did everything on the ground, because then it is much easier for the horse to understand. Maybe I have to add one little detail. When we have the young horse, and the young horse is now ready for riding with a bit and so on, I keep the young horse on the longe. So I have two persons, the rider and the ground worker. In the beginning, the more advanced person is the longeur, the ground worker. And the not so experienced person is the rider. And that will change after a while. But when the horse is on the longe, then I can add all my information and all my aids on the longe, and the rider can try to give the rider's aid, but the horse has not to respond on that directly. It just learns to feel the aid. And then we can take it over, the aid from the groundwork to the rider. And in the moment where I see now the horse understood what I want, I take the longe off, and then you can directly start. I hear quite often the question, does it take long, for example? Is it longer than other ways? I always say no, it's shorter. Because something takes long when the horse does not understand. When I explain something which I don't want to explain, for example, going against the bit, and that can happen quite quick when you start a young horse, then it takes longer to repair than never ever explain to go against the bit. So that's the reason why I say take a little bit more time in the beginning than it doesn't take time later on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so I find it really worth going into, is you talk about how you look at how the horse is going, maybe what it needs, and then you adapt according to that. So what would you say, when and why would you use, for example, a bitless bridle versus a snaffle versus a double bridle, or just a curb?
It depends actually on the horse. I do not want to say I use in that moment this and that. In the beginning, the horse tells me what they want. I give you an easy example. When I take the traditional way, snaffle bit, and then curb, then it can happen that the horse's mouth is not made for a snaffle, I would say, even if there is no horse's mouth which is made for any specific bit, but at least a horse has a tendency to a bit. And quite often when we have a very slim lower jaw, for example, or sharp bars of the mouth, yeah, or low teeth area, then it can happen that they have a huge trouble with the snaffle bit. So they often show that with a strong behavior of opening the mouth. I am not a big fan of open mouths, I have to say, because I like a supple mouth. But a real uneasy open mouth is often also a stress mouth. Mentally, I see that the horse gets often stressed. It depends a little bit if I do it on purpose, with, for example, suppleness training on the bit, that they can also relax the lower jaw, or if they just clapping the whole time the mouth. So just to make that clear. So, and when that happens, then the horse shows me quite clear the horse does not like the bit. When they do not like the bit, why should I work with it? I mean, when you do not like something, yes, it can happen that you say, I have to do it because I earn some money with it. But when you really don't like it because it is mental stress for you, and you quit it, you stop it. And that's the same with the horse. And when I changed then, maybe already in the beginning of a young horse training, to the curb bit, and the horse says immediately, yeah, a curb bit, because it's not broken, it's a different influence. That's what I like. Then I use it. And Why can I do that? Because with a Cavesson, I have a great tool to use all the effects of a Snaffle, but in a bit less way. That means I cannot use in the beginning maybe the curb for Stallions, bending and so on so good. And maybe also not that good for searching in the beginning, but I can add it in the combination with a Cavesson. And then I can do everything what I couldn't do in the beginning with the curb. I can use the Cavesson for everything I need to make the head and neck axis more supple. And I can use the curb for make maybe lower jaw more movable, but also for the real stretch forward. So you see, I try to concentrate on the horse's behavior and how the horse feels with it. Because I know when the horse feels good, then the horse will do everything for you because it really enjoys the time with you together.
And one thing I also want to add, something I've found in my own experience that I find very interesting is with Stallions, sometimes it can even be a little bit different where it's a bit annoying sometimes if I'm bridling a Stallion who has the character of being very flamboyant with a lot of energy. They can't wait to have the bit and they're looking for the bit and they are looking for it themselves with their mouth.
Yeah.
And then also, I've noticed, for example, if they're in exercises that demand a lot of concentration but also power at the same time, like maybe it's Piaffe or something, then they might start to go on the bit and chomp on the bit. And I found with other horses, this can often mean that they're very nervous, like you're saying, and they're a bit stressed. But with Stallions, it's interesting. For me, I'm still trying to understand it, but it really seems like it's trying to like pack all of this power and energy into this very concentrated movement and sort of like the struggle of doing that. And it's like the bit is some kind of pacifier that is focusing their energy in some way. But how do you see this?
Yes and no, I always say. Yes, many Stallions, they say, yeah, give me something. But it's also because of the nature. They are more made for, taking somebody away with the shoulders and so on, because they are made for that. And they also like to bite into something. That's often also a bit trouble in the groundwork when the humans come too close to the Stallion. But they also often like to bite into a bit or whatever. It's a bit the question if they really like to have it the whole time in the mouth or if they just do it sometimes. But you're right, they are often a little bit more into this bit topic. And in higher exercises where they need a lot of power, it can happen that they use also it to move a bit more in the mouth. And that can be in a very good way. But I think we all have to school a bit the eye. What is it?
Yeah,
because
for
it's
sure.
so difficult. We all in the art of riding speak about a relaxed and movable lower jaw. Chewing is a very strong word for the education. But nowadays I see a lot of different chewing. And I just want to make a bit aware of that. And not only in riding, and not only with a bit. I see it also nowadays in liberty training, horsemanship training, every training. And this is a sign also for us that we have to be a little bit aware if this is positive shoeing or negative shoeing. And there's another thing which I maybe can say, it depends also a bit on your inner thinking, I often say. When we speak about humans and different sport ideas, for example, we have the category, for example, bodybuilders, and then we have the category, for example, ballet artists or whatever. When you see somebody more or less in the bodybuilding, very powerful work, then they often say, hard work. They make a big face, sometimes a ugly face, and so on. And you see really the hard work. And then compared with ballet or whatever, then you see it's nothing. This is hard work. You cannot do that without training. but you see it's a harmonic, slow flow movement. And then it's a question, if you're more in that, let's say, category, or you like more that category. I like more the artist. So that means for the horse, when I see that they have a really strong expression in their face of work, then I ask myself, is it the right time? Is my horse well enough trained for it? Or maybe I need to wait a little longer before I can go the next step. I'm a big fan of given influence to be better. For example, give the masculine influence to be better. And that means we have to do maybe 2 more steps than I thought to let the muscle grow. But I'm not a big fan that I say do more and more and more, and my horse gets stressed. I know it from my own training. When I get stressed, it can be a little bit positive stress for my muscle, but there is also a border where I feel, no, that's too much. And my body will also tell me that. And then everybody sees it also, because I start to cheat, for example, in the training. I do not a real physical movement anymore. That's the same with the work, and then it's with the horses. And then it can happen that the horse tries to compensate with all this mouth stress. And when you see a rider which takes this idea into account, then you do not have this behavior. You see more the ballet dancer.
And you were also briefly mentioning before about the horse seeking the bit. This is something that's often looked for in training. Can you talk about how you understand this and what it looks and feels like in your training?
First of all, it should feel soft. That's the most important thing. And it's never ever taking the reins. It's more about giving the reins. Giving the reins is much more difficult than taking the reins. I mean, that's also the problem we have nowadays. But it's also quite simple. When I teach horses and pupils, then I often say there exists a neutral position in the horse's body, which comes automatically to the seeking.
To the what?
To seeking the bit, to search the bit. So when I take, for example, the reins on the neck, and the horse just goes here in the manege straight away, then the horse shows a nodding. So the horse in walk shows the nodding and goes up and down with the neck, and it gets automatically into a neutral position. And that's for me that the horse has no right standing, no left standing. It has more or less a normal stretch, horizontal stretch with a nice nodding. And when that happens, then you have this searching, which I want. And when I take reins, then I just try to feel that I cannot disturb this stretching. And when I don't disturb, then I have actually my stretch to the hand, or my seeking to the hand.
And let's say if you have a horse that has trouble with this, let's say they have a very high head posture and they're quite tense, how would you encourage them to then relax and seek the bit?
First of all, I always say, wait a little bit. So the shaping of the neck comes in the end, I always say. So first of all, try to get as much as possible this kind of neutral position, and then start to move. Start, for example, with some transitions. Walk, trot, walk. When possible, take canter, a bit longer canter. And you will see after a while, it doesn't take so long, even a very high lifted neck by nature will start to find the relaxation in more stretching. And then we have what I explained before. Of course, there are many exercises which I could mention now to get it, especially the influence to the hindquarter with all the side movements, shoulder in, haunches in, and so on, will help us a lot. But in the beginning, everything comes so easy and quick automatically that I do not want to do so much for it, especially not with the hand.
How do you use the stretching position in your work with the extension of the neck? And also, because from what I've seen, there's a lot of collected work in the academic art of writing. So how do you use, let's say, a stretched or extension of the neck, and how do you balance this with the collected work?
The academic art of writing wants everything, I always say. And they do not say there is just a vertically lift. We need the whole time. And they do not say forward down is what we need the whole time. They say we need a forward down in the beginning, in the basic education, and also really good and safe forward down to lift the horse. Why? It sounds sometimes a bit strange. Why should I go down when I want to go up? Because we know when I go up too early, then I lose maybe the tendency to go down. And in every lift should also be a tendency to go down. Down means for me not down to the sand. It means more horizontal, I always say.
Long.
Long is a better word. So we can extend the frame. Maybe I can explain it like that. So when I can extend the frame, then my horse seeks to the hand in every situation. And even in the Piaffe, I would like to see that my horse can search my hand if I give. And that's the biggest secret also to check up if you're on the right way. If you give and the horse is not following the giving because it is a bit stiff and hanging and cramped in the high collected exercises, then it can happen that they freeze in the exercise. And especially in the moment where we have bending of the haunches, it can happen that a horse gets stuck in it. And when they get stuck in it because of too much collection, then we do not only get maybe mental stress, we get also a lot of physical stress because the flow through the spine, the energy doesn't go forward anymore. And that's tricky. A person who is into the art of riding will always collect. And when they collect and the forward idea is missing, then it's not a good collection anymore. Then it can also happen that we get a lot of wrong collected exercises, trick exercises in the end. And then it's more for an end in itself instead of it helps the horse.
Yeah.
So for me, to check up if my work is good, I always end up in forward and in lengthening of the neck. Even with the Piaffe, maybe you have seen my presentation on Saturday with this white horse in the Piaffe. And I spoke a lot about what to do when the horse is educated in the Piaffe. I do not place my horse on the spot and say, do now 5 minutes Piaffe. I try to gymnasticize my horse with the Piaffe and I search for the suppleness in the Piaffe. And that I can do, for example, by make the horse movable in a forward Piaffe. It's not on the spot, it's maybe with 1 or 2 hoof size forward. And then I go, for example, in a half pass through a shoulder in or haunches in to feel if all the basic work still exists. And then I come back that I'm a big fan of basic work.
You've said so many things that I find super important, and I just want to go back briefly about what in English usually we call it long and low. I think this is super misunderstood, but I've also seen both cases where I would see people understanding long and low, meaning the horse's head is almost on the ground. And unless the horse has really a lot of strength and the rider has a lot of knowledge in what they're doing, the horse can end up with a lot of weight on the front end. Yes. And they can collapse a bit through the chest. On the other hand, people who would never do long and low, or they would never allow the neck, let's say, to extend and lengthen the frame, sometimes I've seen horses where they really do get stuck and they're not able to actually relax. And so they have quite a tense top line, even if they can do a lot of advanced collected exercises. The suppleness isn't the same as if you have a horse that can both extend the neck forward and then also shorten it as well.
To make it clear, we also have to say, when a horse is lifted in a collected exercise, this is just one part of a training session. I mean, the art of riding, yeah, is art, but it is also real training. So we need to learn also a bit more about the training's principles. So that means when I have a training session with a horse, I always start more or less with the longer neck position to make also longer steps in the different gaits. So, and when I have this, I can feel that the horse is much easier in the flow and the swinging of the back, and the horse can also relax but prepare for the work which comes after that. Then I start often early with a more powerful work, because I do not want to make my horse tired with all the rest. But in between the more powerful work, I go back also to the more bigger stretch. So, but for me, it's the forward down, something which is absolutely important, and it should be always there when I want that. But it's not really, like you said,
It's
this
not
is
down.
low down. The reason for that is, yes, I do not want too much weight on the forehand, but the next reason is the horse, yes, is grazing on the ground, but it's not the whole time running forward on the ground or into the ground. And many horses, when they are not so well on the haunches by nature, they have a big problem with it, because they do not feel that they can go forward. They have more the feeling that they get blocked. For example, a horse which has with heavy shoulders, yeah, strong shoulders, which are by nature very strong on the forehand, they will get even more heavy, and then the rider feels need for driving, and then you drive more and more and more, but in the end, the horse is just running to the ground.
You end up with a train, feels like a train just going forward and down.
They get stuck with that training. So this is more or less a misunderstanding of the downwards, forward down. But I have to say, a good forward down is also a key for mental balance. The bending of the haunches is something very important, but if you do it too much, it can also create a lot of stress. And that's also the reason why I often say I'm more into the ballet artist than only bodybuilding, because mental stress is not so good for a horse, because it runs into the physical stress. So with a good forward down, I can always find a nice balance in between, because I can make a powerful work where they need a lot of craft, but when the muscle cannot work anymore, then you need something different. When I do 20 sit-ups and I feel it doesn't work anymore, then I cannot do 20 more. I have to make a little break that my muscle can refresh.
Now going to the airs above the ground, one of the things about your work and about other academic riders is that you do things way beyond the Piaffe and Passage. You do terre-à-terre or a croupade or a levade or a capriole. I've heard you say before that training for you really starts to get interesting after Piaffe and Passage. And this is something that a lot of dressage riders never do, because at the moment, the most advanced exercises in competition are Piaffe and Passage. But for you and other academic riders, why do you use the airs above the ground, and how do you find this can be used to benefit the horse?
Yeah, for me, it was one of the most fascinating thing, the schools above the earth, why I choose the way of the art of riding, because it's absolutely fantastic to see how this power can be controlled And the next thing is, how can I teach it? In the beginning, it's so far away how it is possible. I saw a lot of old pictures, but also modern pictures of riders who did it. And that was more or less also a goal for me in the beginning. Nowadays, I see it a little bit different. And that's also the reason why I do not use so much the name master for my own person. I always say I'm more the advanced beginner. I like that a little bit more because the art of riding has so many different topics that you feel the more you understand that you have not enough experience to get there. So that makes it interesting because we can always get better and learn more, but sometimes it makes also a little bit, let's say, sad because you feel one life is not enough. The schools above the earth is for me so interesting because we do not have so many persons who can teach that. And we have a lot of books where you can read about it. And I see when I do that with my horses that they really like it and that they have also benefit out of that for the rest of the education. I give you a practical example. For example, my Fleur de Lys, he's not the best horse for trot exercises. He's a fantastic horse, has a lot of expression, but he has not a very good swinging of the back. That means everything which needs trot mechanic, like Piaffe, is not his favorite exercise. When I use mezairs or the coupade, he does a much better Piaffe than he would do when I do the normal traditional race, like trot, come back to the collection, school walk, go into the Piaffe. So he has a big benefit out of that. And I see it in many horses that they like it. And also in many horses, I see that when they get a little bit stress or uneasy situations, I can help them also with this kind of frame and exercises to relax. So I see it not only as an absolutely high exercise, especially not as a show exercise, not at all. I see it more as a relaxation exercise. You know that maybe that many masters use also Piaffe for relaxation. When a horse is already educated, then it can happen that the horse can do the Piaffe, use the Piaffe to come down when they're a little bit stressed. So it's not always a shouldering in walk. And that's the same for me with the schools above the earth. Yes, I could say I educate already some horses in that. And nowadays it belongs also quite early to my system. But I wouldn't say that I'm absolutely experienced in that. There are so much more which we can learn. And that's the reason why I love the academic art of riding, because we are a brain pool. The masters in the academic art of riding, they are very close to each other. They are never ever competing, and they are more a brain pool, a group of people who make an exchange. And that's great, because we can learn quicker than we could do when we do it alone. So when Bernd or Christopher do something with the jumps, then we are always in a conversation and we try to figure out how is the best way. We do it in different ways, also extra, to add it together a little bit. That we did also with the school hold and so on. I do not want to say that other people who are dedicated to the art of riding don't do that, especially here at the Moorhof stables. we try to collect them a little bit, as you can also see with our event Fair to the Horse. And we try to collect the experience because I think that's so important. We are all in one direction. We all do it for the horses. And then it's also important that we try to share the experience instead of saying we are the best and that's the only step. That's, I think, not good for the art of riding.
Yeah, you benefit a lot from learning from your peers. Absolutely. Yes. And I think one life really is not enough, unfortunately. But
it is not enough. One thing to the schools above the earth, if we have time, I start also with that in the groundwork. I do not start always in riding because it's the same with the groundwork. I can see everything, but I can also support in different positions. And that's quite important for all this work. Quite often I need to support, as usual, the hindquarter. But it's often also good to stay behind the hindquarter or beside the hindquarter to make a little jump, to give a little soft touche or a little influence. And I always teach my horses with soft touches. We say touche point or touches, or with optical aids. So I just show the whip. I don't use the whip with a strong, let's say, hit or whatever. So because I see if you do that, that the muscles often cramp a little bit more because of the strong touch or the influence. And then you get the opposite around you want. You get more push or whatever instead of more stepping under. And that's the reason why I schooled myself a lot in this right touche points. I could say you can write a whole book just with touche points or optical aids, which makes it much easier for the horse. And that's also something which from the ground easier to do. And there's another point. When a horse is jumping or doing a capriole, in the beginning it's not so easy to find the right movement. You can compare that with walk, short, canter. In the beginning, when you're a learner, then you need to find the good flow to accompany the movement. And with the jumps, it's the same. When you are not in a good movement in the beginning because the horse is searching for the right way, then you disturb a lot in the jumps. And one last point, you see, I like that topic, which is for me so interesting, is the fact that you see on all pictures, most of the time, a rider which is in an absolutely perfect body posture, without stress in a jump. If you see modern pictures or show exercises, it's missing. Most of the time, you need a lot of knee pressure to stay alive in the caprioles. Or you see a lot of strong expression in the face of the rider, or a bad seat, because they get a huge power against the seat by the jumps. And then I was a bit wondering, how is it happening? Is it just because a king must be in a very good posture?
And they just painted him that way to look good?
Of course. Or is it maybe because they have a different way of teaching it? And I can tell you right now, for sure they had a different way. It was maybe both. Yeah? Because I did already some caprioles and I do a lot of passo e salto, coupade, ballotade, mezairs, without problems in sitting. Not because I have a strong knees or legs. No, because the horse is very well in the haunches. And when a horse is very well on the haunches, it doesn't matter what kind of jump you do. It is soft. That's the same with the passage and with the piaffe. And a good piaffe or passage is never ever a passage or piaffe where the rider has to bounce or has to be very active. It's like a smooth wave. And that's the same with the jumps. And therefore, I try to find out how can we teach the horse that it's still playful, my main wish, and in that way that I can easily sit on top.
And I have to ask about the seat now, because these are the most collected exercises that someone can do. And I think there is a lot of confusion about how you can collect the horse using the seat and not just try to squish the horse between the hands and the legs. So how are some ways that you can use the seat, or people can use the seat, to seat their horse and collect them?
Yeah, I could explain a lot how it works, what I do, for example, with my hip, in which direction I go, in which rotation I work, and so on. But I think it's more interesting for the listeners to understand that I explain and teach the seat to the horse, as I do with the hand and so on. So I see every little detail in the seat as a single part. So for example, the hand is a single part which I have to teach. The upper body is a single part. We call that the statical seat. And my middle position, the hip, is one single part. Of course, we cannot split it. We cannot so easily say, isolate this part and this part. It belongs together. But I can try to make sure that my horse understands that I teach right now the right seat bone or left seat bone or my tailbone or pubic bone. So, and when I want that, then I have to add that in my training, that the horse really understands for a shoulder in. I do this and that change with my seat bones, and I do it always in the same way. Instead of pressing the leg, using the rein, there was something like seat bone. Where's my seat bone? So, and that's my main secret why it hopefully looks light what I do, and hopefully is invisible. The more invisible my aid is for the spectator's eye, the more clear it is for my horse. And the more I have to do, maybe because the atmosphere produce something like that, that I have to do more, then my horse asks me, what are you doing? I don't understand that because you do so much. So that's because I mainly focus on my middle part and my upper body, statical seat. And I add it always first in my training, and then comes the rest. Then I add the leg or maybe a little bit rein when I feel I cannot communicate only by that right now in that second. That's the reason why we also say secondary aids, and the rest is the main aid.
And so you mentioned in the very beginning, when you were young, I think you were still in your teens, you also got your professional education as a rider. So you were following more typical modern dressage techniques. And I really wanted to ask you, now that you're very into the academic art of riding, which is its own world, how would you compare the approach and just the understanding of the philosophy using the typical methods in modern dressage versus what you do and teach now?
Yeah, so I have my own bubble nowadays, I always say. So that's art of riding, the bubble, my own world. But I did a professional education, and I always say that was also good. I'm quite thankful or grateful for that, because I had the chance to learn from many different persons, stables. I had a lot of stations, and I had also the luck to be in a lot of international stables and also competition stables. And I think without that, I wouldn't find my way which I have today. It was not so easy to quit with that, because when you think you are successful, why should you quit with something? But as I mentioned in the beginning, I had the luck that I could get different perspectives quite early in my teens, and I kept it always in my mind. In my teens, I was not ready to say, that's the right way, that's what I want. But the influence was so important. The earlier you have a good influence, the more you are open to change your thinking. So then it took a little bit time, but I always used this, sometimes people call it alternative ray. I use it already in my normal professional competition ray to add this philosophy and technique. And that was something which made my training more successful. And then came the point where I felt when everything is so successful by using more the alternative things, why should I do the other way? When this is more hard, needs more strength, needs more time, more or less, because you often go in that way and in that technique also against the horse's wish. And it was never ever so playful. And that was so fascinating, but that was also the main point why I could manage to change. And nowadays, I'm really thankful that that was happening, because that's my world, that's my life.
So if you were to meet your past self before you started with classical riding, and you were discussing about your riding and everything, what would you say to your younger self?
To my younger self, be patient, I would say, but that's not possible in a younger age. But time is one of the biggest secrets in the art of riding. I always say AI makes everything easier nowadays, everything shorter, quicker, and so on, but it depends a little bit how you use AI. If you use it just to shorten up everything, I think it's not so good. If you use it to learn with it something, then it can be very interesting. And that's a bit with the art of riding the same, just to use some modern words. I say the art of riding is never ever something which you can get with a download button, but it's upgradable. So upgradable, but in the end, it still needs time. And if you patient and if you enjoy your time with the horse, because we cannot take it for granted. It's something, it's a gift that we can do that as a hobby. When you use and enjoy your time, then you get the best partnership ever you can get. So, and that's what I also try, not only to explain people in the teens, I also explain that people in older age, because time is not normal nowadays. Many people run into the stable because they have to move the horse. I always say if the horse stays on a good paddock, pasture, whatever, they don't need the movement, they have the movement. They're also quite happy with food and field and friends. But you can make the time with the horse even more interesting for the horse, and the horses like the human contact if you do it in a good way and take your time.
This is definitely something that I see a lot of people going to the stable a bit stressed because they have to do something with the horse and it's very time intensive. On the other hand, riding takes a long time to learn very well.
It's not the easiest thing you can do.
No. It does require a lot of patience, like you say. It always helps if you have a good teacher. For you, it's definitely been bent. And I hope that, riders always find someone who can really show them, because it shortens the process considerably, even though it does need a lot of patience.
It shortens a lot. And nowadays we have also the positive aspect of online teaching.
Yes.
I mean, in the past it was often like that. The best rider in the club was the role model, was a master more or less. But it does not mean that that was a good rider. Nowadays you can see with social media or in general with the internet so many different riders, and you can try to find out what's best for your character, I always say, because riding is also a bit depending on the character, depending a lot on the experience, of course, and also influence, which comes from the outside. So, and I often say, it's so easy because when you see a video of a young girl, she does everything very easy, soft. maybe without reins and so on, then search for something like that instead of a frustrated man or girl which is harming the horse. That's not a good role model.
If you look at the state of sort of the riding world today, and you look back on your own experience through your career, what do you wish more riders knew?
I wish that they take more time for the biomechanical point of view, because this is more and more given nowadays, but not enough. But I also wish that they try to spend at least a little bit time into the old master, because the old masters can give us and tell us also a lot about good training, but at least also a bit about biomechanical good training. I always say they had not the same methods like we have today, or not the modern techniques like we have, but they had a very good feeling because they did nothing else than riding. And that is something what we do not have today so much anymore, and especially not as a hobby rider. So, and for this reason, it makes sense to read the book. It makes sense to hear podcasts maybe about old masters and so on, or with masters, to listen, to understand what they think, what is important. And yeah, these 2 points are very important. And maybe one point is also use more time for groundwork or liberty work, because groundwork and liberty, especially liberty work, helps a lot to understand how a horse is thinking and how strong a horse is responding on you, even if you don't do something with mechanical tools like a rein. So just placing your foot to any direction or move your shoulder in any way makes a big difference for the horse. And liberty work explains you also a lot about focusing. If a horse is focused on you, or if the horse is focused on whatever. When a horse is not focused on you, then the horse cannot learn very good, and a horse cannot understand what you want so good because it's focused on other things. So therefore, liberty work teach humans to be absolutely in the right time, on the right place, and be with a horse.
I think those are very good points. I also wish for more understanding of not only the horse, but the biomechanics and the history of riding as well. You learn so much. There's so much more than so many people realize to riding. And there's even more, even for people like you who are very advanced. There is still so much to learn.
So much to learn. And you see, when you have nothing to use, for example, rein or saddle, bit, whatever, when you have nothing, when everything is simple, just your simple body language, and you know how you can communicate with your horse, then it is so easy if you have a rein. So easy if you have a bit, because when you don't need it, but you have it, then you just use it when it really makes sense, but in general you don't use it. And that's the secret of lightness.
Marius, thank you so much for joining me. I think this is one of the things that I was impressed with the most when I was here, is the lightness with which you work. It's really lovely to be able to be here at your stables and watch you work. I hope that this conversation gave people a little bit more understanding of all of the knowledge that goes on behind what you do, and inspires them also to develop with their horses more, but in so doing also improve the relationship they have with their horse. This is also very important and something I know you focus on a lot in your work. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I just wanted to thank you also for also putting so much emphasis on teaching what you know. You're very active teaching online and also in person and having events like there was this weekend.
I have to say, that's my passion.
But this is good because I think it's not so often that you find people with this knowledge and these abilities, especially, for example, for not only liberty, but the airs above the ground. and to see that if you go to this high level, then how light it is also, but from everything, from the basics up to the high level. And so I want to just thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your methods with everyone listening.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
It's been a pleasure.